In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people wave politely at each other from manicured lawns, an ordinary Sunday afternoon was about to take a sharp turn into the extraordinary. Cars hummed faintly in the distance, birds chirped lazily from the treetops, and the world felt like it was spinning in the kind of peaceful rhythm that so many take for granted. That's when a seemingly small incident began unraveling into something much bigger, a moment destined to challenge assumptions, test patience, and deliver a dose of karma no one saw coming. The story begins with a father and son enjoying a sunny day at the local park. Marcus, a black man in his late 30s, radiated warmth as he chased his giggling 6-year-old son, Ethan, across the grassy field. Ethan, with his unruly mop of blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes, clutched a bright red soccer ball as though it were his most prized possession. They were a striking pair, not just because of the love they clearly shared, but because their bond defied the shallow assumptions of those who looked at them and didn't understand the full picture. As they laughed and played, their world seemed immune to the undercurrent of judgment that often simmered in public spaces. Marcus had grown used to the curious glances and occasional double takes, the subtle signs that some people found his family dynamic puzzling. But he had promised himself long ago that Ethan's joy and sense of belonging would always come first, no matter what. Enter Linda. Sitting on a bench not too far away, her sharp eyes tracked every move Marcus and Ethan made. To her, something about the scene didn't sit right. Her mind raced to connect dots that weren't there, filling in gaps with stereotypes and suspicions rather than facts. The thought of a black man with a white child stirred her imagination in all the wrong ways. As Marcus tossed the ball gently to Ethan and crouched down to tie his son's shoelaces, Linda's inner alarm bells reached their peak. Within moments, she was on her phone, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "Yes, I'm at the park," she said. "There's a man here with a little boy, and, well, it just doesn't seem right. I don't think the child belongs to him. Can you send someone to check it out?" Unaware of the storm brewing, Marcus continued playing with Ethan, oblivious to the growing tension across the park. But Linda's call set off a chain of events that would soon disrupt their peaceful afternoon. 10 minutes later, the wail of a police siren pierced the tranquil air. Marcus turned toward the noise, confused but not yet alarmed, as 2 uniformed officers approached him with a firm but measured stride. "Sir, can we talk to you for a moment?" one of the officers asked, his voice steady but serious. Ethan clung to his father's leg, sensing the shift in mood, but not quite understanding what was happening. Marcus's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. He had seen this kind of thing play out before, though never firsthand. He could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny and the eyes of strangers who had paused their own activities to watch the scene unfold. "Of course," he said calmly, his voice betraying none of the unease creeping into his chest. "What's this about?" Before the officer could respond, Linda appeared, her steps quick and purposeful. "I'm the one who called," she announced, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. "I just thought, well, it didn't look right, him being with that little boy. I mean, they don't look anything alike." Marcus glanced down at Ethan, who was clutching his hand tightly now, confusion clouding his bright eyes. "This is my son," he said firmly, meeting Linda's gaze. "His name is Ethan. We're just here to play soccer." But Linda wasn't backing down. "You'll forgive me if I don't just take your word for it," she replied. "I was only trying to protect the child. You can't be too careful these days." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable as they turned back to Marcus. "Do you have any identifications, sir? Or something that confirms your relationship with the child?" one of them asked. As Marcus reached for his wallet, his mind raced. He knew he had nothing to hide, but the humiliation of having to prove his fatherhood in front of his son and a growing crowd of onlookers was a sting he hadn't anticipated. "Daddy, what's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Marcus knelt down to Ethan's level, placing both hands gently on his son's shoulders. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "We're just going to answer some questions, and then we'll get back to playing." But even as he spoke, Marcus could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He didn't want Ethan to see him lash out, to internalize the bitterness that moments like these could breed. He wanted to be the kind of father who rose above ignorance and pettiness, who showed his son what strength and dignity looked like. What neither Marcus nor Linda knew was that karma was already working quietly in the background, setting the stage for a resolution no one saw coming. The truth, when it finally emerged, would turn the tables in a way that left everyone, officers, onlookers, and even Linda herself, reeling. And while Marcus had every reason to feel anger, what happened next would prove that sometimes the best response to injustice is simply letting the universe do its work. This was no ordinary day at the park, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, nothing would ever be the same. The officers stood quietly for a moment, letting Marcus sift through his wallet. Around them, the park had fallen into an awkward silence. Parents ushered their kids to the other end of the field, not wanting to get involved but unable to resist sneaking glances. Linda crossed her arms, a smug expression spreading across her face as if she'd done the world a favor. To her, it was just a matter of time before the truth came out, her version of the truth. Marcus finally pulled out his driver's license and handed it to the officer. He also produced a small, folded piece of paper from his wallet. "This is Ethan's birth certificate," he said calmly. "I carry it with me for situations like this." The officer examined the documents, nodding slightly as he read. "Thank you, sir," he said. His tone was polite, but Marcus could tell he wasn't quite ready to walk away yet. "Can you tell us what you're doing here today?" Marcus exhaled, trying to keep his frustration in check. "We're playing soccer," he said, gesturing to the red ball now sitting forgotten in the grass. "We do this every Sunday when the weather's nice." "And you're Ethan's father?" the officer pressed, glancing briefly at the child who was still clinging to Marcus's leg. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "I'm his father." Ethan looked up at the officer and nodded. "This is my daddy," he said, his small voice cutting through the tension. "We're playing soccer. Can we go now?" The officer's expression softened slightly, but before he could respond, Linda stepped forward again. "Look, I'm sorry, but this just doesn't add up," she said, her voice growing sharper. "How does a man like him have a kid like that? I mean, come on." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Marcus felt a flash of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He knew better than to let her get to him. "A man like me," he repeated, his tone measured. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Linda faltered for a moment, realizing she had crossed a line, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "I'm just saying it's unusual," she stammered. "People don't usually. I mean, families like yours aren't common around here." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to the officer. "Are we done here?" he asked. "I've shown you everything you need to see. My son and I have done nothing wrong." The officer hesitated, clearly caught between wanting to de-escalate the situation and feeling the pressure of Linda's continued accusations. "I think we're good here," he finally said, handing Marcus's documents back to him. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir." But Linda wasn't done. "That's it," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "You're just going to take his word for it. What if that child's in danger? What if he's being coerced or something?" Ethan frowned and clutched Marcus tighter. "I don't like her, Daddy," he whispered. "Can we go?" Marcus stood up straight and looked Linda directly in the eye. "Ethan's not in danger," he said firmly. "The only thing upsetting him right now is you." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly ready to wrap things up, but Linda's insistence was making it difficult. One of them turned to her and said, "Ma'am, we've checked everything out, and there's no reason to believe anything is wrong here. I suggest you let it go." Linda huffed, her face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Fine," she snapped. "But don't say I didn't warn you if something happens." Marcus took Ethan's hand and started walking away, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares as he led his son back to their car. Ethan looked up at him, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Why was she so mean, Daddy?" he asked. Marcus sighed, searching for the right words. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different," he said gently. "And when they don't understand, they get scared. But it's not our job to make everyone happy, buddy. It's our job to be kind and keep doing what's right." Ethan nodded, his small hand gripping his father's tightly. "I can think she was kind," he said. Marcus smiled faintly. "No, she wasn't. But we don't have to be like her, do we?" As they drove home, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Linda's words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of the biases and assumptions he had fought against his entire life. He had hoped that Ethan would be too young to notice these things, that he could shield his son from the ugliness of the world a little longer. But today had shattered that illusion. What Marcus didn't know was that karma was already setting its sights on Linda. The officers had filed a routine report about the incident, and while they hadn't taken any action against her, that body cameras had recorded everything. A local journalist who frequented the park had also captured part of the confrontation on their phone, and the footage was quickly making its way through the community. In the coming days, the ripple effects of Linda's actions would grow larger than she could have imagined. Marcus, too, would find himself at the center of a conversation he hadn't asked to be part of, but one that would ultimately shine a light on the resilience of his family and the strength of their bond. But for now, as they pulled into their driveway and Ethan raced ahead to grab his soccer ball from the trunk, Marcus took a deep breath. Today had been hard, but it wasn't the end of their story. Not by a long shot. As the days passed, Marcus tried to move on from the unsettling incident at the park. He focused on work during the day and spent his evenings making sure Ethan felt loved and secure. They had their routines, reading bedtime stories, practicing soccer drills in the backyard, and playing silly games that left them both in fits of laughter. But no matter how much Marcus tried to bury the memory of Linda's accusations, they lingered like an unwelcome shadow. At work, Marcus found himself distracted, replaying the scene in his head. He wondered if he could have handled it differently, if there was something he could have said to make Linda understand. But every time he tried to craft a perfect response, it felt futile. He knew people like her didn't change easily. Meanwhile, the video of the incident was quietly gaining traction online. The journalist who had recorded part of the confrontation decided to post it on their social media account, along with a caption that called out the racial bias on display. It wasn't long before the clip was being shared, sparking heated debates in the comments. Some viewers sided with Marcus, expressing outrage at Linda's assumptions and praising his calm demeanor. Others, however, echoed her concerns, saying she had every right to act on her suspicions. The internet's polarized reaction turned what had been a private humiliation into a public spectacle, one that Marcus hadn't consented to but was now a part of. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Linda was also dealing with the fallout. Her face and voice had been clearly captured in the video, and she quickly became a target of online criticism. Strangers flooded her social media pages with comments ranging from polite education about racial dynamics to outright insults. At first, she doubled down, defending her actions and insisting she had only been trying to protect a child. But as the backlash grew, her confidence began to waver. The local community wasn't immune to the controversy either. Parents who frequented the park started whispering about the incident, and some avoided Linda altogether. She had always been a fixture in the neighborhood, organizing bake sales and charity drives, but now her reputation was tarnished. For the first time, Linda began to question whether she had acted out of genuine concern or something else entirely, something far uglier. Back at home, Marcus found himself drawn into the online discussion after a coworker mentioned the video. He was initially mortified to see such a personal moment shared so widely, but as he read through the comments, he realized the conversation had taken on a life of its own. People were using his experience to discuss broader issues, from systemic racism to the challenges of interracial families. One evening, as Marcus scrolled through the comments on his phone, Ethan climbed onto the couch beside him. "What are you looking at, Daddy?" he asked, peering at the screen. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to burden Ethan with the full weight of what was happening, but he also believed in being honest with his son. "It's a video from the park," he explained gently. "Do you remember that lady who was upset with us?" Ethan nodded. "The one who didn't think you were my dad." Marcus smiled sadly. "That's the one. Some people took a video of what happened, and now a lot of people are talking about it." Ethan furrowed his brow. "Are they saying nice things?" "Some of them are," Marcus said, "but not everyone. Sometimes people see things differently, and it can take a long time for them to understand each other." Ethan thought about this for a moment, then wrapped his arms around his father. "I know you're my dad," he said firmly, "and you're the best dad ever." Marcus hugged him tightly, feeling a surge of gratitude for his son's unwavering love. "Thanks, buddy," he said. "That means the world to me." As the week went on, the story continued to ripple through their lives. Marcus received a call from a local news station asking if he'd be willing to share his perspective on what happened. He was hesitant at first, wary of exposing his family to more scrutiny, but after discussing it with a close friend, he decided to do the interview. "I think it's important to tell your side of the story," his friend had said. "People need to hear from you, not just see a video." The interview was straightforward but emotional. Marcus spoke about his love for Ethan, the challenges of being a single father in an interracial family, and the hurtful assumptions people sometimes made. He didn't dwell on Linda's actions, but instead focused on the larger lessons he hoped people could take away from the experience. Linda watched the interview from her living room, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. Seeing Marcus speak so openly about his love for his son and the pain her actions had caused left her feeling defensive, but also deeply ashamed. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who cared about others and did the right thing. But now she was beginning to see how her biases had clouded her judgment. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Marcus and Linda simmered quietly in the background of their small community. They both continued to frequent the park, though they carefully avoided each other. Marcus tried to let it go, focusing on being the best father he could be, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the incident had left a lasting mark, not just on him, but on Ethan. Linda, too, was grappling with the aftermath. She found herself replaying the moment over and over, wondering how she had let her assumptions get the better of her. She started reading articles and watching videos about racial bias, trying to understand the deeper issues at play. The process was uncomfortable, forcing her to confront parts of herself she had never examined before. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths were on a collision course. The unresolved tension between them was like a storm cloud hovering over the neighborhood, growing darker with each passing day. And when the storm finally broke, it would bring revelations that no one could have predicted. Life in the neighborhood carried on, but the weight of what had happened at the park continued to linger. Marcus noticed how some people looked at him differently now, not with the curiosity or confusion he was used to, but with something closer to admiration. Strangers occasionally approached him to express their support, telling him they had seen the video or watched his interview. He appreciated their kind words, but he also found them exhausting. Every interaction reminded him of that day, of the way his relationship with his son had been questioned in such a public and humiliating way. Ethan, too, seemed to be carrying the experience in his own quiet way. He still laughed and played like any other child, but Marcus could tell that something had shifted. He asked more questions now, about why people didn't believe they were family, about why some people thought differently because of the way they looked. Marcus did his best to answer honestly, but he hated that Ethan had to wrestle with these questions at such a young age. It was a weight no child should have to carry. For Linda, the fallout was even more personal. The whispers from her neighbors had turned into outright avoidance. People she had once considered friends no longer invited her to their gatherings or waved when they saw her on the street. She had tried to brush it off at first, convincing herself that she had done the right thing, but the isolation was starting to wear on her. She felt like an outsider in her own community, and the loneliness forced her to reflect on her actions in ways she never had before. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus and Ethan returned to the park. It was the first time they had been back since that day, and Marcus felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach as they approached the field. But he refused to let fear keep them away. This was their space too, and he wanted Ethan to know that they belonged there just as much as anyone else. The park was busier than usual, with kids running across the playground and families scattered on picnic blankets. Marcus spotted Linda sitting on her usual bench, her posture stiff and her eyes fixed on the ground. He felt a surge of anger rise in his chest but pushed it down. This was not the time or place for a confrontation. He had come here for Ethan. Ethan, oblivious to the tension in the air, ran ahead with his soccer ball, calling out for Marcus to join him. Marcus smiled and jogged after him, his focus on his son. But as they started kicking the ball back and forth, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Linda looking their way. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that gave Marcus pause, an uneasiness, a flicker of something that looked almost like regret. Linda didn't approach them, but Marcus could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on him. He tried to focus on Ethan, to enjoy the moment, but the tension was impossible to ignore. And then, just as he was starting to relax, something unexpected happened. A little girl, no older than 4, came running toward Ethan, her arms outstretched. "Hi," she said brightly. "Can I play too?" Ethan grinned and nodded, tossing the ball to her. Marcus watched as the two kids started playing, their laughter filling the air. He looked around for the girls' parents and spotted a woman walking briskly toward them. At first he tensed, worried that another misunderstanding was about to unfold, but as the woman approached, she smiled warmly at Marcus. "Hi," she said. "I hope you don't mind. My daughter's been watching your son and wanted to join in." "Not at all," Marcus replied, returning her smile. They seemed to be having fun. The woman introduced herself as Rachel, and the two of them fell into an easy conversation as they watched the kids play. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of normalcy. But as they talked, he couldn't help but notice Linda still sitting on the bench, her gaze shifting between him and Rachel. Her expression had changed. She looked almost conflicted. The tension reached its peak when Rachel turned to Marcus and said, "I think I've seen you before. Weren't you the one in that video from the park?" Marcus froze, unsure of how to respond. He glanced at Ethan, who was still playing happily, and then back at Rachel. "Yeah," he said finally, "that was me." Rachel nodded, her smile fading slightly. "I saw it online. I can't believe you had to go through that. It was so unfair." Before Marcus could reply, Linda stood up from her bench and started walking toward them. Marcus's stomach tightened as she approached, her steps slow and deliberate. Rachel noticed her too and fell silent, sensing the tension in the air. When Linda reached them, she hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of what to say. Then, taking a deep breath, she looked directly at Marcus. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her voice quieter than he expected. Marcus glanced at Rachel, who gave him a reassuring nod, then turned back to Linda. "Okay," he said cautiously. "What is it?" Linda glanced at Ethan and the little girl playing nearby, then back at Marcus. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I wanted to say, I think I owe you an apology," she began, "for what happened that day, for the way I acted." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Marcus stared at her, unsure of how to respond. He could see the discomfort on her face, the effort it had taken for her to approach him like this. But he also felt the weight of everything she had put him through, the humiliation, the pain, the questions Ethan had been forced to ask. Linda continued before he could speak. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said, "and I realize now that I was wrong. I acted out of fear and ignorance, and I hurt you and your son in the process. I'm so sorry." The sincerity in her voice took Marcus by surprise. He had imagined this moment many times, but he had never expected Linda to actually apologize. He looked at her for a long moment, his emotions swirling, anger, relief, and something he couldn't quite name. But before he could respond, Ethan called out, "Daddy, come play." His voice broke the tension, pulling Marcus back to the present. "I'll be right there, buddy," Marcus said, giving Ethan a small wave. Then he turned back to Linda, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your apology," he said finally, "but this isn't just about me. It's about my son, and what he had to see and feel that day." Linda nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm sorry for that too." The moment hung between them, unresolved but charged with emotion. Marcus could feel the weight of everyone around them, the kids playing, Rachel watching quietly, and the unspoken tension that had brought them to this point. Something had shifted, but the resolution was still just out of reach. Linda wiped her eyes, clearly overwhelmed, but Marcus wasn't ready to let the moment become a resolution just yet. He knew her apology was a step, but it didn't erase the harm that had been done, not just to him, but to Ethan. He nodded curtly, signaling the end of the conversation, and turned back toward his son. Ethan and Rachel's daughter were now racing each other across the grass, their laughter ringing out as they collapsed onto the ground in a pile of giggles. Marcus couldn't help but smile at the sight. But just as he started to move toward them, he noticed someone else approaching from the corner of his eye. A man in a crisp suit, carrying a briefcase, was walking toward the group with purpose. He didn't seem like the type to be casually strolling through a park, and his presence immediately set Marcus on edge. The man's eyes darted between Marcus and Linda before settling on Linda. "Mrs. Collins?" the man asked, his voice professional but with an edge of urgency. Linda stiffened, turning toward him with a look of confusion and apprehension. "Yes," she replied hesitantly. "My name is Andrew Garrett," the man said, pulling a business card from his pocket and handing it to her. "I'm with a law firm handling a recent civil suit. I believe you've been served with initial papers, but I wanted to follow up in person." Linda's face went pale. Marcus froze, his heart racing. A civil suit? Against Linda? He hadn't filed anything, and as far as he knew, no one else involved in the park incident had either. He exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, who looked equally stunned. "I don't understand," Linda stammered. "What civil suit?" Andrew adjusted his glasses, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "The case concerns an incident of public defamation and racial discrimination that occurred 3 weeks ago at this park. It's being pursued on behalf of a minor and their parent. Details were provided in the initial filing." Marcus's mind raced. He hadn't even considered legal action. His focus had always been on Ethan and making sure his son felt safe and loved. He stared at the lawyer, wondering who could have taken such a bold step without his knowledge. Could it have been someone who saw the video? A community member? Or was it possible that Rachel, or someone else he hadn't even considered, had filed on his behalf? Linda's hands were trembling as she reached for the folder. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said weakly. "I apologized. I've been trying to make amends." "This matter will proceed according to the legal process," Andrew said firmly. "If you have questions, you can direct them to our office or consult your own counsel." Linda looked as though she might collapse, and Rachel quickly stepped forward to steady her. The tension in the air was palpable, and Marcus felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: shock, curiosity, and even a flicker of vindication. But he also felt a pang of discomfort. This wasn't how he had wanted things to unfold. He hadn't wanted to drag Ethan, or anyone else, through a public legal battle. Andrew nodded briskly and turned to leave, his briefcase swinging at his side. But before he disappeared, he paused and looked directly at Marcus. "If you'd like to discuss this matter further, Mr. Carter, our office would be happy to arrange a meeting." Marcus's stomach dropped. He hadn't even realized the lawyer knew his name. "I didn't," he started to say, but Andrew held up a hand, signaling that he understood. "The case is already in motion," Andrew said. "Take your time to consider your options. We'll be in touch." As the lawyer walked away, Marcus felt the weight of 100 unspoken questions pressing down on him. Who had filed the suit? And why had they done it without consulting him? He looked at Linda, who was clutching the folder as though it might disappear if she let go. Her face was a mask of fear and regret, and for the first time, Marcus wondered if this was what justice looked like, or if it was something else entirely. Rachel broke the silence, her voice cautious. "Did you know about this?" she asked Marcus. He shook his head. "No, I had no idea." Linda finally found her voice, though it was shaky. "This can't be happening," she said, her eyes darting between Marcus and Rachel. "I know I was wrong, but this? A lawsuit? I can't afford this. I can't." She trailed off, her words dissolving into a sob. Marcus didn't know what to say. Part of him felt she deserved to face consequences for what she had done, but another part of him couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. Linda wasn't the only one affected by this. The lawsuit could bring even more attention to his family, dragging Ethan back into a spotlight he'd never asked for. Just then, Ethan came running up to him, his cheeks flushed and his hair sticking out in all directions. "Daddy, did you see me?" he asked excitedly. "I ran so fast." Marcus crouched down, forcing a smile. "I saw, buddy. You were amazing." Ethan beamed, oblivious to the tension swirling around him. But as Marcus hugged his son, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The conflict that had started with a single moment of ignorance was now threatening to consume their lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. And yet, even as the stakes rose, Marcus knew the story wasn't over. There were still questions that needed answering, truths that needed uncovering. And as much as he wanted to shield Ethan from the chaos, he also knew that some battles couldn't be avoided. The only question now was what kind of father he wanted to be in the face of it all, and whether he could find a way to turn this storm into something that could build, rather than break, the life he and Ethan were trying to create. The days following the encounter in the park were a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions for Marcus. The looming civil suit was all anyone seemed to want to talk about, and it left him feeling as though his life was no longer his own. Calls from reporters started coming in again, and even some local community leaders reached out to offer their support. But Marcus wasn't sure what he wanted or needed. All he knew was that Ethan came first, and the last thing he wanted was to drag his son into another round of public scrutiny. Then, one evening, as Marcus was cleaning up after dinner, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his heart pounding. "Hello. Mr. Carter, this is Andrew Garrett. I represent the plaintiff in the civil case against Linda Collins." Marcus's breath caught. He hadn't heard from the lawyer since their meeting in the park. "What do you want?" he asked cautiously. "I wanted to inform you of a development," Andrew said. "It's important for you to know that the plaintiff is someone who wishes to remain anonymous for now, but they have a vested interest in ensuring justice is served, not just for your son, but for others who have faced similar situations. They believe this case has the potential to set a significant precedent." Marcus frowned, gripping the edge of the counter. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want a lawsuit." "I understand," Andrew said, "but the plaintiff has made it clear that their goal isn't financial gain or retribution. They've even pledged to cover any legal costs associated with the case. They simply want to see accountability." The conversation left Marcus feeling conflicted. On one hand, he understood the importance of standing up against discrimination, of making a statement that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable. But on the other hand, he worried about what this would mean for Ethan, for their lives. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take on the weight of being a symbol for something bigger. The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected visit. Rachel, the woman he had met at the park, stood on his doorstep with a determined expression. "We need to talk," she said. Marcus invited her in, and as they sat at the kitchen table, she explained why she was there. "I think I know who filed the suit," Rachel began, "and I think you need to know too." Marcus leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Who?" Rachel hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of what she was about to say. "It's Linda's son, Kevin." Marcus blinked, taken aback. Her son, why would he do that? Rachel explained that Kevin had seen the video and was horrified by his mother's actions. Apparently, he had confronted Linda about it, but she had been defensive at the time. Unable to convince her to truly take responsibility, Kevin had taken matters into his own hands. He had approached Andrew Garrett, a family friend, and asked him to pursue the case anonymously. He felt it was the only way to make her understand the impact of what she did, Rachel said, and to make sure it didn't just get swept under the rug. The revelation left Marcus speechless. He had never considered that Linda's own family might be the ones to hold her accountable. It was a twist he hadn't seen coming, and it left him feeling both hopeful and uneasy. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. Marcus had decided to attend, not because he wanted to, but because he felt it was important to see this through. Linda was there too, sitting at the defendant's table with her lawyer, her face drawn and pale. When Kevin entered the courtroom, Marcus watched as Linda's eyes widened in shock. It was clear she hadn't known her own son was behind the suit. As the proceedings unfolded, Kevin took the stand to explain his actions. He spoke with a calm but firm conviction, detailing how he had felt compelled to act after seeing the harm his mother's actions had caused. "It wasn't just about what she did to Mr. Carter and his son," Kevin said. Linda sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Tears streamed down her face as her son's words pierced through her defenses. For the first time, Marcus saw genuine remorse in her eyes, not just for what she had done, but for the rift it had created within her own family. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiff, citing the importance of accountability and the need to address systemic issues of bias and discrimination. But the resolution wasn't about punishment, it was about education and reform. Linda was ordered to complete a series of community service hours focused on diversity training and education. She was also required to publicly apologize, not just to Marcus and Ethan, but to the community she had let down. As they left the courtroom, Marcus spotted Linda and Kevin standing together in the hallway. She was crying, and he had his arm around her, speaking softly. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step toward healing. For Marcus and Ethan, life slowly began to return to normal. The incident at the park had left its mark, but it had also brought unexpected allies and lessons. Marcus knew there was still work to be done, both within his own heart and in the world around him. But as he watched Ethan run across the park one sunny afternoon, laughing and carefree, he felt a renewed sense of hope. And just when it seemed like the story was finally over, Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was from Kevin, thanking him for his patience and resilience. But there was one line that stood out, one that sent chills down Marcus's spine. "This is just the beginning. People are watching now, and change is coming." It was a reminder that the fight for justice didn't end with one lawsuit or one apology. It was a journey, and Marcus and Ethan were now part of something much bigger than themselves. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for Marcus and Ethan. The courtroom drama had stirred up emotions and memories that Marcus hadn't fully processed, but it also brought an unexpected sense of clarity. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. He knew who he was, what he stood for, and what kind of father he wanted to be for Ethan. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brighter, if slightly scarred horizon. Linda's public apology had been both heartfelt and humbling. She stood in front of a gathering organized by the local community center, her voice trembling as she admitted her mistakes. "I let fear and ignorance guide my actions," she said, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I hurt people who didn't deserve it, and for that I am truly sorry." Marcus had chosen to attend, sitting quietly in the back with Ethan on his lap. He didn't expect her words to fix everything, but hearing them felt like a step toward healing. Ethan had leaned up to whisper, "Is she saying sorry to us, Daddy?" Marcus nodded, holding his son close. "Yes, buddy, she is." Kevin had remained a quiet but steady presence throughout it all. After the hearing, he reached out to Marcus again, not to dwell on the past, but to talk about moving forward. "I don't want my mom to just apologize," Kevin had said over coffee one afternoon. "I want her to really understand, to do better. That's all I've ever wanted." Marcus respected Kevin's courage and his unwavering belief in accountability. He found himself thinking often about the younger man's determination to take a stand, even when it meant challenging his own family. It reminded Marcus of his own father, who had taught him to stand firm in the face of injustice, no matter how daunting it seemed. Rachel had become a friend and an unexpected ally. She and Marcus stayed in touch, often meeting at the park so their kids could play together. One day, as they watched Ethan and Rachel's daughter climb the jungle gym, she turned to him with a thoughtful look. "Do you ever think about how all of this could have gone differently?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "All the time. But I also think about how it's shaped Ethan and me. He's learned that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's hard. And I've learned that we're not alone. There are people willing to fight alongside us." Rachel smiled. "That's a good way to look at it. I think you're raising a pretty incredible kid." The letter from Kevin stayed with Marcus, tucked away in a drawer where he kept mementos and keepsakes. Every now and then, he would take it out and read the line that struck him most. Asterisk, "This is just the beginning. People are watching now, and change is coming." Asterisk, it was a reminder that while their story had drawn attention, it wasn't the end of the work. It was just a chapter in a much larger book. One afternoon, as Marcus and Ethan walked home from school, they passed by a group of kids playing basketball at the park. Ethan tugged on Marcus's hand. "Can I play too, Daddy?" he asked, his eyes lighting up with excitement. Marcus hesitated for a moment, memories of that fateful day flashing through his mind. But then he looked at Ethan, at his bright smile and unshakable optimism. "Of course you can, buddy," he said, leading him toward the court. As Ethan joined the game, Marcus found himself talking to one of the other parents on the sidelines. They chatted about their kids, the weather, and the local school district. It was a simple, ordinary conversation, but it felt monumental in its own way. Marcus realized that while the journey hadn't been easy, it had brought him here, to a place where he could feel a little less guarded, a little more hopeful. Later that evening, as Marcus tucked Ethan into bed, his son looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are there always going to be mean people like that lady at the park?" he asked. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "There might be," he said honestly. "But there are also people who will stand up and say that's not okay. And there are people like you who can make the world a better place by being kind and brave." Ethan nodded, satisfied with the answer. "I'll be brave," he said confidently before snuggling into his blanket. As Marcus turned off the light and closed the door, he felt a deep sense of peace. The events of the past few months had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but they had also shown him the strength of his community, the resilience of his son, and the importance of speaking up. The story had started with fear and misunderstanding, but it had ended with growth, accountability, and a renewed sense of purpose. In the quiet of his living room, Marcus sat down with a cup of tea and reflected on the journey. He knew their story had resonated with people far beyond their small town, sparking conversations about race, parenting, and the power of accountability. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it with an open heart and the unwavering belief that change was possible. The next time Marcus and Ethan visited the park, things felt different. Familiar faces greeted them warmly, and even strangers smiled as they passed. The shadows of the past were still there, but they were fading, replaced by a brighter, more hopeful vision of what their community could be. As Ethan raced ahead to join his friends, Marcus watched him with pride, knowing that while their journey had been difficult, it had been worth every step. And as he stood there, he felt a quiet certainty. This was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them, and they were ready to face it together.